Good day, everyone. My name is Rumbi Chakamba. I'm an associate editor here at Devex. Thank you so much for joining us for this session on decolonizing global health through autonomous manufacturing in Africa. Today, I'm joined by a great range of speakers to unpack this topic. And as we all know, Africa imports between 70 and 90% of the drugs consumed on the continent, and only 1% of vaccines used are produced on the continent. The IU has set a goal to change this 1% figure to 60% by 2040. Our panelists are going to break down how we can actually achieve that and some of the challenges that the continent is currently facing. To kick off our conversation, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Natalie Donbeck, who will be speaking with Mutoni Wanyeku, Regional Director for Africa at Open Society Foundations, about improving financing for autonomous manufacturing in Africa. Natalie.
Well, hi, everyone, and thank you so much for that really interesting introduction to today's event, Rumbi. My name is Natalie Donbeck, and I'm an associate editor and reporter with Devex. And I'm very excited to be diving into this topic today of autonomous manufacturing and really how important it is both for health equity and global health at large. So today we'll be zooming in on the African continent, and currently actually imports account for 70 to 90% of all drugs consumed in most sub-Saharan African countries. And this is driving up costs for patients and even putting their lives at risk during moments like the COVID pandemic and the supply chain disruptions that we've seen. So to tackle this really interesting topic, I'm really excited to be joined by Mutoni Wanyeku, who's a regional director for Africa at Open Society Foundations. So welcome, Mutoni. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, I know you're traveling and about to rush to the airport, so I think we'll dive straight into the first question. And I really wanted to start with a question that focuses in on ordinary African citizens. And, you know, what would more autonomous manufacturing of drugs, of vaccines, of treatments mean for them, both in terms of accessibility and affordability of these medicines and diagnostics, but also ultimately their health?
You already gave the figure of sort of the reliance of Africa and dependency of Africa on imports for not just vaccines, but diagnostics, therapeutics, which of course really we saw the impacts at the beginning of the COVID pandemic when there was hoarding of everything in terms of where Africa normally imports from. That has an impact first and foremost on the question of saving lives. You know, even as recently as last year, the WHO has estimated that 6 of 7 cases of COVID go undetected because of lack of testing. Even now, only just under 20% of the majority world's population is vaccinated. And obviously what that means is if people catch COVID, the likelihood of their having severe cases to the extent of losing lives is an issue. So that's the most obvious, that increased African R&D, increased African manufacturing at scale could improve the supply, could improve availability, could lower costs to governments of purchases and just save lives.
Great, yeah, thank you so much for that overview. And you know, throughout the pandemic, we've really seen a lot of conversations take off about everything from the TRIPS waiver to new models of sharing intellectual property. But what's really needed to enhance more public-led, you know, open science, common good manufacturing? What does that mean in terms of how it's, you know, implemented and really rolled out on the continent?
I mean, there are two strands and two, I would say, distinct approaches to increasing autonomous manufacturing of vaccines, of therapeutics, and diagnostics on the continent. One is a more distributed model that does sort of deal with, I would say, decentralizing production of big pharma in Africa, and several African governments have signed up for that. And they're issues that would enhance kind of sharing of that kind of distribution model really have to do with, questions of IP, the big debate around the TRIPS waiver. Less discussed is what countries can do even without the waiver in terms of TRIPS flexibilities, and more, paying more attention to national regulation of IP. But the second strand that I think is really important, and much, much more important, is really the strand and the approach that focuses on developing whole value chains for R&D all the way to manufacturing, which would mean investments in science and our scientists, and regulation and support of research on the continent. It would mean thinking about what it takes for a scientific innovation to move to market, and all the regulatory questions around that, and common standards across the continent on questions of regulation. And then real decisions around procurement by African governments individually as well as collectively. We saw that happen in the first phase of COVID with the development of the African Medical Supplies Platform, but we need that kind of commitment ourselves to procurement of what is going to be produced on the continent, which of course is a lot easier now given the sort of regional integration imperative, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And so thinking of whole value chains from, like I say, from scientific innovation and research all the way up to sale and use.
And picking up on what you mentioned regarding innovations, I wanted to also dive a little bit deeper into what's needed to prevent health innovations and manufacturing from being purely driven by market forces in a way that actually undermines health equity. For example, we've seen the case of Aspen in South Africa struggling to get enough orders in for their vaccines. So how do we position this autonomous manufacturing and R&D within the public interest? What's needed to galvanize it in that way?
I mean, I think it's really understanding the whole system within which vaccine production or medical supplies production, right? We have to really understand that private monopolies globally of big pharma are disincentivizing. Right now, only 4 countries account for 90% of the COVID vaccines in circulation. And we've seen a steady kind of deindustrialization over time from 1997, when 55 states had manufacturing capacity, till in 2015, only 20. So there is something about private monopolies that do not act in the public interest or understand these products as being global public goods that has an effect of crowding out, just like all private monopolies do. So there is the question of sort of thinking of the work in this area as being global public goods, understanding and paying back for the public investments that go into scientific innovation in the, across the world. Understanding that scientists themselves tend to sort of operate as open source communities, and we saw that in amazing kind of degrees in the first phase of the pandemic. But then their scientific output suddenly gets captured by developers that can take it to scale, and without investments in like I say, the whole value chain by states that do have an interest in seeing these products as public goods, we can't get much further.
And what's really the different roles played here, let's say by international bodies, by the global health community, by individual states? How can responsibilities be divided up, and making sure that this actually translates to changes on the ground?
The normative questions at the global level and the contradictions between, on the one hand, the public health regime that's overseen by the WHO and the international multilateral trade regime overseen by WTO needs some sort of, those contradictions need to be sorted out. But at the national level, I think there are lots of things that can be done. I think in terms of people that are interested in investing, there are lots of things that can be done in terms of investing in initiatives around R&D and manufacturing that build local capacity, that rely on local sourcing. And, you know, it's not like examples don't exist. Where I work at OSF, we've made an investment in Afrigen, which is the WHO hub that will produce the first African vaccine for COVID. We've made investments in Institut Pasteur in Dakar. And I think within Africa, it's also understanding that for the scale that's needed and for the costs of this sort of value chain approach, not every country needs to be producing, but we need to take a collective regional approach on all aspects, and which the scientific community does. I don't know if you've heard, for instance, of the African Research Universities Alliance, which we also invested in. They have three vaccine production hubs, one in Ghana, one in Uganda, one in South Africa. And that kind of understanding of the need to pool and share and work collectively is extremely important.
Great, and thinking kind of ahead of the future of these potential regional hubs, could you talk a little bit more about kind of the business case for supporting the development of a thriving autonomous pharmaceutical industry on the continent, not just from the perspective of, you know, getting cheaper and more accessible drugs to people, but what are some of the economic benefits it could bring as well?
Again, thinking of value chains, number one, we improve investments in our scientific output, research outputs. Number two, we can improve investments in our innovations and startups. Number three, obviously, we're increasing the possibilities for skilled jobs on the continent in African companies, whether it's in labs, whether it's in the actual industry itself. So, I mean, of course, the benefits go beyond the public health benefits.
And I can imagine it's also connected to overall health system strengthening and tackling, you know, a potential future crisis of the lack of healthcare workers, which has been flagged by many.
Because this isn't just an argument about decreasing Africa's dependency and moving to sovereignty. That is not just a rhetorical kind of argument. It is about preparedness for the future. And I think COVID-19 brought it really home that we cannot be in this situation again when the next global pandemic happens.
And the next question is really about, you know, how we get the money to make that happen. You've already mentioned some of the investments that OSF has made in Afrigen and Institut Pasteur in Dakar. So what role can really investors also play in helping to support the creation of this, you know, ecosystem on the continent and the development of the domestic pharma industry, really? How can investors help support this?
Well, I think, you know, social impact investors like our social impact investing on the Soros Economic Development Fund, they may not be big in terms of scale, but what they can do is be first movers. They can, you know, provide proof of concept because they can afford to do so. They can leverage much larger funds to come in, and they can work collectively around sort of proving the case that it's worth it, even in economic terms.
And based on your experience with OSF and the investing that you've been doing in the recent years, what's kind of the one piece of advice you would give to other social impact investors in the sense of, you know, what can they do tangibly to better support autonomous manufacturing on the continent?
I think have a really clear idea of business models that, like I say, are not about just diffusing and decentralizing and sharing, although that is one approach to take, but take an approach and really think through business models that are about investing in local capacities, using locally sourced materials, working with an ecosystem of people who work on regulation, people who work on trade, and so on, and business rules within the country. So not just think of the investment as a one-off by yourself. These are issues that have to be dealt with collectively.
Great. And one last question was really about the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing and the goal that they announced, which is to ensure that 60% of all vaccines used on the continent be produced by African nations by 2040. So that's, of course, a really ambitious goal, but what's the role of these types of partnerships in advancing the industry and helping to shape this enabling environment needed for the industry to thrive and really reach this ambitious goal? So looking ahead, what can other partnerships do as well to help aid this goal?
I think what the partnership does, which came out of the Africa Centers for Disease Control, which in itself comes out of the African Union, is provide the coordinated regional platform in which all pieces of the puzzle can be understood, where people's roles and responsibilities really can feed into the bigger picture. That's the purpose of a coordinating platform, to provide the sort of base analysis of the problem and then invite people in who can address different parts of the problem.
Great, well, thank you so much, Muthoni. Those were some really, really interesting insights. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, and safe travels back. And yeah, I know we've got a really interesting panel conversation ahead of us. So with that, I'll hand it over back to my colleague, Rumbi. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for that interesting conversation, Muthoni and Natalie, that really broke down the business case for autonomous manufacturing in Africa. Our next group of panelists are really going to dig into some of the challenges that have been faced in trying to establish this, as well as some of the steps that need to be taken both by partners as well as countries within the continent to advance this autonomous manufacturing. And I am joined today by Dr. Gitanji Gitahi, Group CEO for Amref Health Africa, Dr. Ebere Okere, a Senior Technical Advisor at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, Professor Pedro Terreblanche, Managing Director for Afrigen Biologics, Dr. Moga Kamal Yani, Senior Health Policy Advisor at UNAIDS. Thank you so much for joining me, everyone. So just to kick us off, from the last conversation that Natalie just had with Muthoni, it's clear that COVID-19 has shown the continent that things need to change and that manufacturing needs to start happening within the continent. And there's this ambitious goal of manufacturing 60% of our vaccines by 2040. There have been a lot of movements towards achieving this, with vaccine manufacturing hubs being built or already built in Rwanda, Kenya, Senegal, and South Africa. And there seem to be quite a lot of moves towards this. But in addition to some moves, one of the cases that Muthoni highlighted was that of Aspen. Aspen sort of led the charge in terms of establishing a manufacturing facility with their Johnson & Johnson's deal. But a few months down the line, they were announcing that they may have to stop operations because of a lack of demand for the vaccine. So just to kick us off, I'm going to turn to you, Pedro, as you are on the front lines of this fight. What are some of the challenges or roadblocks that countries and pharmaceutical companies like Afrigen are facing when establishing these local manufacturing plants? And maybe could you just break down for us, when we speak about decolonizing global health and when we speak about autonomous manufacturing, what exactly are we talking about?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute. Let me start with your last question. How do I see decolonization of public health? And in a way, I'm going to use decolonization, manufacturing as the indicator. If we look at the African continent, this continent hosts, in many aspects, the biggest reserves for natural products and minerals that the global financial community and manufacturing community are using. We do not beneficiate the fantastic raw materials on this continent. We export it to the Northern Hemisphere and other countries where these essential elements of medical technologies and products are being beneficiated and then returned to us. For me, decolonization is to have access, reliance, and manufacturing in equilibrium, and where the continent utilizes its its own raw material, build its skills, and become self-reliant, but also sustainable. That is an essential part of us having the essential health products that we require on this continent manufactured here. We've talked about the benefits of local manufacturing, and I think other speakers might go into that in terms of socioeconomic benefits. Tony mentioned skills development, innovation, and I think we can spend some time on that in the discussions. What are the challenges? And I think the challenges that Aspen has been facing is partly also in the ecosystem. How do we create market certainty? If we want to build a sustainable manufacturing sector on this continent, we have to minimize market uncertainty. Part of that is the policy environment. It is to implement the PAVM strategies. It is to look at procurement behavior and procurement systems globally and locally to benefit and give preferential procurement incentives to local manufacturers, create a sustainable environment where investments in sustainable manufacturing risks are minimized, where product
I think we may have lost Petra, but we'll give her a few minutes to see if she'll be able to jump on. But as we wait, I'll pass the same question on to you, Abir.
Thank you, Rumbi, and thanks for inviting me to join this really important discussion. So starting from the question about what we mean about decolonizing global health with reference to vaccination, I like the definition of global health that the late Paul Farmer used, which was around, he said that global health is not an academic discipline. It's a collection of problems that turn on the quest for equity. I think that is a brilliant definition of what we're trying to achieve with global health. It's about equity. So if we bring it into the space of vaccine manufacturing or broader medical technology, production of medical technology, then we need to ask ourselves, what do we want to achieve? And it's about equity. Now, equity means not being the afterthought in the consideration for access to new technology. Equity means, like Petra was saying, not relying on other regions of the world to value add before we have access to products that we contribute the raw materials for. Equity means ensuring that where we have the highest burden of disease, we're in the front of the line for the therapeutic solutions. But again, it isn't just about other people doing it and fixing it for us. We also have, as a continent, responsibility to start to define our role in achieving that equity, be it in response to vaccine manufacturing specifically, or access to the broader instruments for health improvement and disease prevention generally. So I see Petra is back online, so I'm going to pause so she can complete her thought.
Thank you so much, Abir. Yes, Petra, please continue.
My apologies to everybody. I'm at the airport and it seems that internet in South Africa is not going to be very stable from this side, but let me continue. I was talking about the challenges. It is very important that we create a conducive environment for trade and for sustainable manufacturing. What is also required is that we build a skills base, and it's difficult to build a skills base if there is not manufacturing that will pull and provide careers for people in the sector. So this is a bit of a chicken and egg, but the strategies that's currently being put in place is to build capacity and build skills across the continent to be absorbed by many manufacturers. What is also important is access to technology. We need to create an environment where bilateral and multilateral technology transfers can happen in a sustainable manner. We need to very carefully look at the portfolio of vaccines that we decide that we will manufacture on the continent. We have to be very carefully look at the technology platforms that we create here. I think, in short, it is important that the continent takes a coordinated and a collective approach to the implementation of the PAVM strategy. That strategy is as good as it gets. It's for us to implement all the elements that is included in that strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Ebere, you gave us a very wonderful definition of what equity is, what equity should be. And from Petro, we have the strategy in place that's wonderful, perfect strategy in place, but implementation is not so easy, I assume. So Ebere, would you like to take us through some of the challenges that you have seen and some of the roadblocks that we need to overcome in order to achieve this?
Certainly. I mean, of course, it's not easy, but just because something is difficult doesn't mean it can't be done. And I think it was Nelson Mandela that said it's impossible until somebody does it. Or something to that effect. So like Petra said, we framed what the Partnership for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing aimed to do was to define what do we have to have in place to successfully and sustainably manufacture vaccines for Africa's needs. First and foremost for Africa's needs, but more importantly, to contribute to the global system for vaccine manufacturing. So to do that, we looked at what are the characteristics and what are the enabling factors that need to be in place. And Petra has mentioned some of the talent development, regulatory system, research and development, funds for the actual manufacturing itself, having a mechanism for ensuring that the money gets to those who most likely do it, defining what vaccinations we need to actually prioritize. So that's been done. The what has been defined in the framework for action that PAVM have developed. And the next phase now is in the implementation. And there are two things that I think are critical that we need to, the approach we need to take, and that is around coordination. As has been mentioned in the Muthoni's conversation earlier, we can't all start competing with each other. This is an expensive industry, and it is one where there is a defined market. And in order to enter the industry at this stage, we need to have a coordinated access to that market. And we need to ensure that those entities, those companies, governments, countries that have the best potential to deliver for the continent are collectively supported, rather than all 55 countries saying, well, we're going to enter into vaccine manufacturing ourselves. So coordination is the first thing. And Africa CDC, and now that the African Medicines Agency is coming into being, they're in the position to drive some of that coordination. Aligned to the coordination is the policies. We actually need to ensure that we create a trade environment that supports and prioritizes African manufacturers. That's already been mentioned. We've talked about the challenges with Aspen, for example. And we have the Free Continental Trade Agreement that should enable us to start to define what manufacturers we will favor in order to support them to become sustainable and then to compete equitably with the rest of the world. So those are two critical things, coordination being the first one, and coordination, of course, is linked to the political will. There has to be a political will and a political agreement. And that, I feel we need to stress, this is not the first time we've talked about vaccine manufacturing on the continent. The conversation has been happening for many, many years. What is different now, I believe, is a very clear African Union heads of government commitment to a coordinated approach to deliver this. And this has got to be supported. The funding, of course, has got to follow. That's the other issue. Now, there are two arms. There is the need for our own governments to invest in this ambition through public sector funding. There's a need to leverage funding opportunities from private sector, whether they're commercial interests or from foundations and other donors. It is in the global interest to make this industry successful and viable. And it would, in the long term, there's going to be a lot of money required at the beginning, but in the long term, it will actually result in an increase in the manufacturing capacity for the globe, which means that it should, when the next pandemic comes, we'll have more capacity to switch to producing new products as required, rather than what we had this time, which was a long lead from the time the vaccine was identified and created to the manufacturing capacity to scale up to the world's needs.
Thank you so much. And so, Avery, you spoke about this regional approach and coordination, and you also spoke about the need for political will, and that at this point in time, we are actually seeing that commitment from African leaders. Gitanji, I just want to ask if you're seeing the same. Are you seeing this political commitment, and what else do countries need to actually do before we start looking at what donors need to do and what partners need to do? What else do countries need to do?
Thank you, Rumbi, and I hope my network is stable enough for me to contribute. And I've been listening keenly to Petro and Nebere and Alia Muthoni, and we are aligned. So I would agree, yes, that there is a movement and a momentum that has not been seen before. But let me just reflect on a few facts. Number one is that this conversation of autonomy of pharmaceutical manufacturing for medical commodities is not new. The pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for the African Union came into force in 2007. Through the Ebola crisis, it was still not activated. We are now talking about the COVID-19 crisis. It's still not activated, and we are now looking at monkeypox and asking, where are we going to get the vaccines for monkeypox if it indeed becomes widespread? So there are challenges we need to ask ourselves. What has been going on? Because despite the fact that we adopted the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan in 2007, Africa is still importing more than 80% of its medical products. Secondly, even where Africa produces, we have less than 400 pharmaceutical producers across the continent. Compare that to more than 5,000 in India and more than 10,000 in China. So we have to ask ourselves the critical questions about beyond the advocacy, beyond the policy, beyond the agreements that we are making and the momentum that I'm seeing now. What is really the crux of the matter? What is the elephant in the room? Why are we not succeeding? And I think that is really the big question. And I think that the question has to rotate around, first is we have to recognize that Africa really is a landmass. It's not as such a continent. It is a landmass of so many countries that operate completely independently. And therefore, when you talk about an Africa manufacturing plan, there is nothing like that, because every problem is local, is national. And even now, when we talk about decolonizing global health, actually, I think for me, it's more up to say decolonizing national health, because it is the national health systems that are colonized by importation. The global health, as it is defined by Berry, is an equity construct. But when you get down to activity, it's about what's going on at the national level. So if the continent has 54, 55 odd countries that all have national regulatory systems, local markets, then you have a global plan, then that plan must be based on a global agenda as well of lack of competition and a collective agenda of regulation, a collective agenda of a market, a collective agenda of financing, and none of those actually does exist. So this is where the real challenge is. Now, when we think about how to move forward, as you're asking, we need to think around these challenges. What has made India succeed with 5,000 manufacturing plants and Africa with 375, and even with the 375, Africa is not exporting, it is exporting so little, 85% of even what is manufactured in the continent. With those few, even when you talk about the 1% of vaccines and you talk about maybe the 20% of medical products manufactured in the continent, Africa is trading within itself. It's only about 85% of exports within Africa are going to African countries. So we must start to ask ourselves, what is really the issue? And I think that there are certain things we need to address. One is a continental free trade area. It is the market. We must make the African continent one market. When you make it one market, you create market incentives. And I know that all of us want to believe that medical products should not be, literally not be subject to market forces. The reality is, in a continent where significant amount of money is actually out of pocket, medical products are based on market forces. We cannot ignore that fact. Vaccines, which are delivered to the continent, are the only thing you can say are kind of public goods in the continent. But who pays for them? It's donors, not African governments. When you look at HIV medication, TB, malaria, it's actually donors. But the products that people purchase for non-communicable diseases, the products that people purchase for occasional infectious diseases that are out of the major three, are market forces. People buy out of pocket and spend a significant part of their income. So we must think about the market. We must think about creating a continental market, and that is going to be enabled by the full ratification of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, where there is free movement of goods, free movement of people, and then the operationalization of the AMA, or the African Medicines Agency, so that we have common regulatory framework. Those things must be thought about. And then finally, the issue that Muthoni talked about, which is reducing geopolitical competition, so that not every country wants to manufacture everything. It's about that free market then deciding where do we manufacture what, and then sharing that. The next thing to say is that we must not look at Africa as a continent that's being required to manufacture medical products for itself. We must think of building continental capacity for Africa to be part of the global supply chain, not for RED to be somewhere in a corner saying we are now building manufacturing sites for Africa. Why? Why didn't India just build for India? Why is India exporting to Africa? Why is America, why is China exporting to Africa? We must think of Africa exporting to India, exporting to China, exporting to America, exporting to Europe. So we must think of the Africa manufacturing agenda as being part of the global supply chain, not only for Africa. The next thing I want to say is that this is going to be enabled, of course, by increasing financing. But we know that Africa has a very low public health expenditure. Of course, we can spend time talking about why it has a small economy, a huge population that is still growing. And even with the best calculations, Africa will not afford more than $50 per capita on health expenditure, even with 15% allocation according to Abuja. So there is scarcity of resources because of many reasons, corruption and the lack of mining of resources and conflict and all these things. But the reality is Africa still has suboptimal financing of health. This is why Africa is dependent on the global community through global health for vaccine delivery through COVAX. Africa absorbs 65% of all vaccines from Gavi, 65%. It is the market of vaccines, actually, despite the fact that they are all coming out of continents outside Africa. So we must also have the conversation about domestic resources, integrating and bringing together the global resources from international aid and directing them and ensuring that they purchase Africa manufactured vaccines. We will not succeed if we don't actually direct the global resources to purchase African commodities. We will not succeed, because if Gavi is not buying Africa manufactured vaccines like we've seen with Aspen, then where is Aspen going to sell to? Yet governments don't purchase vaccines themselves, they receive them from Gavi. So we must think about the global multilaterals and how the money is channeled. We must think about research and developing our own intellectual property, not only waiting for the transfer. That intellectual property must be funded by public funds, because otherwise there are no market incentives for anyone to put a lot of research and development money when there's no market. So public funds must come in. And finally, we must think that these products are going to be more expensive than high volume markets. There is no way you're going to compete with prices here, compete with India and China. We therefore have to accept that there's going to be a premium, a startup premium to Africa products, and that must be acceptable, must not be frowned upon. Thank you.
You have given us so much to think about. It's like if COVID-19 was not a wake-up call for the continent, I think that last 2 minutes might be, you broke down how we've had a plan in place from 2007, but things just don't seem to be coming together. Moga, I want to bring you into the conversation here. What are some of the challenges that you've been seeing along the line?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting discussion and useful discussion. Can I just make a couple of comments before I go to the challenges? And particularly on the Aspen, particularly on the Aspen case, because we hear it all the time. It's like sometimes it's given like, oh, we can't produce in Africa. Look, you can't buy. And actually, although it does show the importance of procurement and sustainability and the issues that colleagues talked about, we mustn't forget that this is a specific case, that by the time Aspen managed to get the contract and managed to do to develop to do the final stages of the vaccine, the whole world, not just the continent, the whole world kind of moved away from these viral vaccines and moved in towards mRNA vaccines. So, you know, if you are an African country, why do you buy something that the rest of the world is not buying? When if you wait a little bit, you know, there's hope that it will come free via COVAX, the good vaccine that's kind of used everywhere in the world. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine was wonderful at the time, at the beginning, because it's one dose. So it was beautiful for Africa. But then came all that saga that we know about. So I hope we don't use it as an example that African production would not be bought in Africa. We can learn lots of lessons, but that's not that one. So colleagues put really critical issues. I really like what you said at the, about why autonomous, because when I look around, the US is not self-reliant on vaccines, nor is the UK, nor is the EU. These are technology generating countries, but they still rely on each other and rely on India for active ingredients and on China and on others to get their to be sufficient in, you know, to get their needs basically. So I think I totally agree with you about aiming that Africa contributes to the whole global supply, production and supply system. And it's not just that when we do, so my second point is when we talk about vaccines, we're not talking about that vial of vaccine as if it kind of, it content come magically inside. Transfer technology, you will have the vial. You still need the vial itself. You need the syringe, you need the active ingredients, you need lots of things to make the vaccines. So when we talk about Africa, and I think Petro mentioned that we have lots of raw material and minerals and things. When we talk about production in Africa, we must remember that we talk about a whole lot of things that we produce in order to make the final pill or the final vial. And we have to invest in all that, or at least we have to decide, okay, so for the first 5 years, we'll invest in this, and then the market will work and we will hopefully would be okay, by which time we can invest on the other and the other, maybe something like that. We do things in phases, maybe do things some together, some in phases. I mean, it depends. I mean, this is a scientific decision. That is not my decision really. So, but the important point for me is to have all the things around the vaccine, not just the fluid that is the vaccine. The other thing is, you know, we keep talking about, so next pandemic will do this and the other. Well, why wait for next pandemic? We do have enough endemic diseases to sort out in our continent. The other thing is, pandemics don't start and whoops, you know, one day there is a disease, tomorrow there's a pandemic. They don't start like that. They start as outbreaks. I lived through the Ebola thing, and it, you know, Ebola, which was endemic in Central Africa and Uganda and you know, DRC. And when it moved, when it started in West Africa, it started as one village, one boy. In fact, they traced it to the little boy from Guinea that crossed the border. So it starts very small. So that is the time that we need to be acting. But even to reach that stage, you need to be building your factories that can produce, and your software. Thank you, Petro. We need the scientists. More important than building the plant, to be honest. You need the people who would work the plant. So once you have an outbreak, we start working on that. We don't wait until WHO says, oh, it's a global pandemic. You know, we had monkeypox for how many years? 50 years. And nobody kind of took any notice of monkeypox. There was a scientist in Nigeria, I can't remember his name, sorry, who said that, you know, for years he's been trying to generate grants to do research on monkeypox, but nobody cared. And now, of course, monkeypox is the thing to worry about. And you know, you talk about equity in vaccines. Who will get the vaccine? DRC, where the mortality rate is much higher than what the rate in Europe, or Europe who can afford it, or the US actually who can afford it. So I think outbreak, endemic diseases, we should look at that seriously in Africa. So I dare say, one of the biggest challenge for me is the software. So we talk, I'm always talking about technology transfer, but actually what we need is the capacity to absorb the technologies that we will get transferred from somewhere. Who has the capacity? So why South Africa is successful in building they have the people who can absorb the technology. This is a prime example of investing, having the scientists who can actually absorb the technology. So that's phase one, absorb the technology. Phase two, develop the technology. Phase three, create the technology. So I think South Africa, Petro, if I understand correctly, you are at the stage of absorb and develop. You are in develop. Hopefully, I really hope that next phase for you is to create new technology. But South Africa can do that because South Africa has scientists. Country X can't do that because they don't have scientists. And I think it's really hopeful that some countries are picking up that quickly now and investing in this, like, Rwanda doing quite a lot of work on this. We as Africans produce vaccine, yellow fever vaccine in Senegal. And we always say, oh, Senegal produced yellow fever. Great, fantastic. Why did it stop at yellow fever in Senegal? Why didn't other countries learn the lesson, the technology, and said, well, okay, you guys do yellow fever. How about we do, I don't know, whatever, something polio, whatever, something measles, something else. But it's this kind of collaboration, and your point about it's national, not regional. This is our problem, actually. You're absolutely right. This is a big problem. It's national, not region. And national, you can't create a self-relying industry. If the US can't rely on itself totally, I don't think any country can, to be honest, in generating and producing medical technology. And medical technology, the science is it's not running, it's marathoning fast, so you need to kind of run after all that. So regional hubs, regional bases are absolutely the thing to go forward. Now, what was the last thing I want to talk about? So I think we hope with the, as you said, Petro, we have the best chance now, despite the 2007, and I have been following that. And one thing that all countries agree, they would be fighting a war, but they agree on local manufacturing in Africa. So we have a plan, and we have interest, and I think now it's seen as much as I want it to be a public health and a human right to health, it is seen as a security for the country as well. Okay, security. And it is, there is some political will, and I have to say, we're tired of political will, but sorry, that is the same political will. You said we don't have money in Africa. Actually, we do. It's a political will to decide that the money goes to that project or that project. There are very few countries in Africa or elsewhere in the world, actually, to have no money. So look where the money is going. So it is political will that decide the money will go, whether you call it corruption, whether you call it a big palace to the president, or whether you call it a new capital, or goodness knows the towers or something, I don't know what. It is a decision by the politicians to do that. And I do hope that they realize it's a security, just like spending on the national security kind of army and police and all these people. This is national security as well, because if a virus hits their army and their police, that's it, they're done. So I think that's an important thing. So basically, my final point is that we need a long-term and short-term strategies in the countries, in the region. So you don't press a button and create a scientist. We talk about tertiary education. For years, I've been arguing that the Africans should spend on tertiary education, and the World Bank and donors, no, just primary. And I want everybody to remember, when you graduated from your primary school, what jobs were you fit to do? And it was because my family were mad about education. I come from a poor family, and I mean poor. I don't mean poor. I mean real poor. But my family was keen
That's
about
a very
education
good point, Smolga.
to get us
And I'm
out.
so sorry.
And my government prioritized education. This is the secret. prioritize education so you can have your scientists, so you can have your production. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Moga. So sorry to interrupt you, but it seems we have spent so much time on this discussion, focusing on the first question, which is the challenges. And unfortunately, we're only left with less than 10 minutes. So I'm going to go back to each one of our panelists. And what I want us to do is think about what are the active next steps we should be taking as countries, as partners, as donors, in order to ensure that this can happen. And where do you see this manufacturing landscape within the next decade? That might be a short period of time, but we're looking at short-term and long-term plans. So where do you see us going from here? I'll start with you, Ebere. And unfortunately, I can only give each of you 2 minutes.
Okay, well, 2 minutes. I'm a public health physician. We have a saying that you never let an outbreak go to waste, because it takes big bang outbreaks to concentrate, to gain the attention of politicians sometimes. So we have global political attention right now. It is beginning to shift, but in Africa, there is a focus here on public health. And one key thing that I think we need to do for the long term is we need to start, and this relates to a comment in the chat about decolonizing ourselves. We, the electorate, the citizens who put those people in government, need to make them aware that health and investment in health is a priority for us. It should be an election mandate, an election priority in every election coming on. Dr. Gitinji is in Kenya. There's an election coming on in the next few days, weeks. Where is health in that conversation? That's how we get the politicians to move from rhetoric to actually starting to put money. That political will we'll talk about. It is going to happen when the people who elect them mandate them to deliver it. So that's one critical thing we need to do, short, medium, long term. One thing that we also need to do alongside what we've already articulated, the Partnership for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing has defined, is we need to look at our current vaccination programs. We need to recognize that currently we are not optimally vaccinating our children for those vaccines that we have access to. Now, we have a theoretical big market in that we know that we don't have full penetration for the vaccines that exist. So if we're asking people and supporting them to manufacture vaccines, we need to make sure we can get those vaccines into the arms. So as a continent, as member states, as individual countries and states, we need to start to look at our vaccination policies and strategies to make sure that we can actually get these products to where they're needed. We need to work and focus on our endemic diseases. One last comment. Endemic diseases, we've got to focus on those because that is what's going to give the market the resilience to be available for the rare outbreaks and the pandemics and etc. We need to build this industry not just for infectious diseases. We need to remember that the next big thing for vaccines is cancer. We have cancer preventing vaccines now. And for us in the continent, that is going to be the technological leap, that we don't have to go through screening and chemotherapy and instead move towards vaccines to prevent cancer. So the work we do today is not just relevant to COVID, to malaria, to the diseases that we always talk about. It's relevant to the things that are going to become increasing burdens for our citizens as our population start to age and exposed to the diseases that are associated with lifestyle. So we have work to do and we have to keep going today.
Thank you so much. We definitely have work to do. And Gitinji, what are the next steps that we should be focused on? And what are sort of some of the long-term and short-term goals you're seeing? And just a quick question to add on to that. I know I've given you limited time, but are we seeing health as part of the conversation in Kenya right now?
Yes, health is part of the conversation. It is, and I know that we are talking around affordability and resources. Let me be very, very clear that Africa has less than 2% of the global GDP with 17% of the global population. If we continue having this conversation as an advocacy conversation, we need to shift it from advocacy to action and choice. With such little money, 17% of the global population, with less than 2% of the global GDP, we can sing until the cows come home. We will never get more than $50, even at the best tax efficiency and with 15% allocation. You not get more than $50, whereas the UK government is spending $4,000 per capita. The US is spending $5,000 per capita. There is two issues. There is the allocation problem because of political will, but there is the scarcity of resources. So the point I want to make here is that we as scientists, policymakers, governments, we must push for choice. Government must decide where to invest the money because they have little of it. We must decide where the money is going to give us the biggest return. And that's what we need to focus on and guide governments, handhold them to make the right choices. Then we make the right choices, then we build for the future. That's really the point I would like to make.
Thank you so much,
yeah,
Ketenji. Unfortunately, we're left with 2 minutes only, and I do want to get to Petro and Moga. Petro?
Thank you, quick one. All of the above, thank you to the other speakers. I think very important. In 2007, I was part of the group that developed the pharmaceutical manufacturing strategy for this continent. We have not implemented. Now we have developed a strategy for vaccine manufacturing, which is a blueprint for all the future ones. Let's implement this. Let's see PAVM strategy as a pilot study. And over to action. We talk so much about what we need to do. Let's now focus on how we do it. And I like the word action. It is time for us to implement the wonderful strategies we write.
Thank you so much, Petro. And Moga?
Thanks. I would just agree with Petra. Let's just go ahead and implement the strategy, and let's get governments to commit to spending money on health and on this on implementing the strategy, and coordinate, collaborate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moga. And thank you to all the panelists that joined us today. I want to say that the conversation was definitely too short. We have a lot of questions that are coming up in the chat that we didn't manage to get to. And I know that we had a lot more to discuss. So let's keep the conversation going in other forums. I know that at Devex will definitely be following this issue. Thank you so much for joining me for this panel. And before we end the session, I want to take this opportunity just to thank our presenting partner, who is the Open Society Foundation, for making this conversation possible. I just also want to alert everyone that we'll be hosting another event on the topic of decolonizing global health on October the 25th. And as you saw today, it's a topic that you can't actually conclude within an hour. So please stay tuned for more information on this and sign up for that next event. And if you are interested in everything that we've been discussing today, I do suggest that you sign up for our global health newsletter, Devex Checkup, which comes out every Thursday. There's another issue coming out tomorrow. So if you sign up for that global health newsletter, you will be able to access our stories and articles where we've been closely following the vaccine manufacturing space in Africa. In addition to that, for those of you who are interested in the localization agenda more broadly, our Devex Pro team has actually released a special report. I think that was released just last week on the state of localization today. If you're interested in reading that and having an in-depth look at the benefits, the barriers, the funding landscape, and areas where change is successfully happening, a link is going to be shared in our chat, and you can access that report as well as more information on localization. Once again, I want to thank our partner, Open Society Foundation, as well as all the speakers that came here today to discuss this very important topic. Here at Devex, we will be taking this opportunity to continue to follow the discussions as well as report on this for you. Thank you so much for joining me this day.